Hi everybody, my name's Dawn. I'm an alcoholic and I'm grateful to be here today with everybody. I have been through this process as it's laid out in the book with the help of a Big Book Step Study sponsor, a loving God, lots of meetings like this, people like you. I still have amends to make and I practice the latter steps to the best of my ability on a daily basis. And so I woke up this morning filled with fear that I was going to come here and speak today. And Denise actually asked me a few weeks ago if I would come and speak. And I immediately said yes to her because Denise is awesome and she comes and speaks for me all the time at a Big Book meeting that I run at Spectrum on the women's unit. And so I said yes immediately, and then I got really sick this week with a head cold, and so forgive me if I'm a little congested and sound stuffy. So I was kind of hoping for a longer reading today. Big Book Step Study taught me how to be honest, and so I guess I'll tell you what brought me into Alcoholics Anonymous. I'll tell you a little bit about what qualifies me as a woman who suffers and recovered from the disease of addiction and alcoholism. My first drink, was young like most of us. I remember it was blackberry brandy and it was stolen liquor and it ended with the police, which is how my last drink ended. And a lot of pain and suffering happened in between that period of time. And my journey in Alcoholics Anonymous has been long and it's been tumultuous, but it's also been freeing. I came into Alcoholics Anonymous 22 years ago, and it was through the Department of Social Services that brought me in. I'm a second offender. I've been in prison. I've lost custody of my children. All those things that alcoholism promises came true for me in my life. And, when I first made a serious attempt to get sober, my son was about 2.5 years old at the time. And the Department of Social Services told me that they were telling me that I could not have him back unless I entered a long-term treatment program where they would place him with me if I did that. So I entered Sigourney House, which is in Worcester, and I went into that program. And they gave me my son. He was about 2.5 at the time, and it was a homeless shelter for women, but it was also a treatment program. And that was really where my journey began. I started to learn about the disease of alcoholism and how it affected my life, and I started to do some step work, and I started to get exposed to the Big Book and the 12 and 12, and most of my exposure to the Big Book at the time was reading the stories in the back. I didn't know really that the steps were laid out in the book until I got to Big Book Step Study. But I think for me, my journey has been, each process of my journey has brought me to a better connection with my higher power, which is the whole point of this for me, to begin with anyways. I just didn't know it at the time. So I did complete that program. I lived in that house with my son for 11.5 months, and I graduated from that program. And I did all the things that Alcoholics Anonymous teaches us to do when we're new, when we come in. And I got a sponsor who was a Big Book sponsor, and not Big Book Step Study, but she was a Big Book sponsor. And I think there's, obviously many ways that we can do these steps. And I did them, the way that she taught me to do them at the time. And I went up to, step 4, and I had done it by way of check sheet. And I made a few half-assed amends to the immediate people in my life. And I never enhanced my, spiritual life. I didn't take it all the way through. I didn't, I went like halfway. And so I had 4 years of sobriety. I met a man in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I married him. And I had, another baby out of that marriage, a little girl. And, even though I was going to a lot of meetings and speaking, I was, my program looked really good from the outside. I, did really, really well in that halfway house to the point where they nominated me through this place called the Moms Project as a mother in recovery, and I was honored at the State House. And so everything really looked good on the outside. My family was back in my life, my siblings, my mom, all those people back in my life. But because I never really studied this book and learned about this process, that moment came. That moment of anger came. Any new marriage is tumultuous at best, especially if, both people are sick. And I was still very sick, but just didn't know it at the time. And I can remember that day as if it was yesterday. We had an argument in the kitchen, just like it talks about, in the book. And I took the wedding band off and the diamond ring off, and I hummed it at him from across the apartment. And I walked out of the apartment, and I walked immediately into a liquor store, bought a bottle of booze, and drank after 4 years of recovery. Not once did I think about God. Not once did I think, oh, maybe I should call my sponsor. Not once did I think maybe I should go to a meeting. None of that entered my mind. None of it. Not 1 ounce of it entered my mind, and I was drunk. And that's when I learned what progression was. I really learned what progression was. I didn't know it at the time, but today I do. And this disease, I mean, even with the bottom that I had hit the first time around, this disease brought me to a bottom that I had no idea I was capable of hitting. So by then, it didn't take long, obviously, for them to remove the children from my house. I think it was a matter of weeks that they had taken the kids out of the house. And, I just did the same thing that I always did. I found a new man in AA who wasn't working a program of recovery, and I had 2 more kids with him, And it was just the same cycle over and over and over again. And in that 4-year period, so I drank after being sober for 4 years, and in that 4-year period, I ended up, multiple admissions to Marlborough Psychiatric Ward, people sectioning me. I had a psychiatrist who was, just trying to diagnose my alcoholism and treat my depression and anxiety. And, it was just insane. It was just a big cycle of insanity. And I ended up doing 2 more halfway houses. I'm also a graduate from Serenity House. And I went into, I came out, and I just wasn't willing to own my part. I wasn't willing to give up the things that I thought were the things that were holding me together were really the things that were tearing me apart. And I had a God in my life, but I couldn't stand him. I thought that God hated me. And I thought that the reason for all of this, pain in my life, the things that were happening to me, never mind my poor 4 children at the time, or 3 children at the time who, weren't with their mother and were watching me just spiral, and in the end, my kids were in 3 different places, 3 different fathers, 3 different places. It was just horrific. And I can remember having that apartment, and I had my apartment still. And I had all the kids' bedrooms set up with all their stuff, but they weren't coming. They didn't come to the house. I had supervised visitation in a supervised visitation center with my kids. That's where my alcoholism brought me, you know, and I couldn't get out of it. I couldn't stop drinking because I couldn't have my kids, and I couldn't have my kids because I could not stop drinking. And I could not see the truth. I could not get myself out of that. Even with, you know, I would get 6 months, I would graduate from the halfway house, I would go back to the relationship because it was going to be different, and it was always the same. You know, I would get together 7 months, I would relapse again, and with each relapse just brought me to a lower point, you know. And in the end, where I was that last, you know, spit, was I had a little beach house. I'm from the Marlboro area. I had a little beach house over by the lake, and I had just given birth to my 4th child. I brought her home from the hospital. How I got her out of that hospital without DSS being in the room is beyond me, because my other youngest son, who was born with fetal alcohol syndrome, was in a foster home in Natick. You know, that's the reality. I don't like to sit up here and talk about that. It's very painful for me, you know, very, very painful for me. But I do it because it's my journey, it's my story, it's my path, it's where this disease brought me, you know. And I can remember my son, who was 2 at the time, had been sitting in a foster home in Natick, you know. I brought his sister home from the hospital. Their dad had been in jail. He was in jail. He'd just gotten out. DSS didn't want us together, and you know, it was just all that ickiness. That's the only word I can come up with. It was just horrifying and icky, and it was depleting, and I could see no hope for myself that I would ever be able to get sober or stay sober or be the mother that I, in my heart, really wanted to be to these kids. You know, I love my children. But this alcoholism thing, man, it just stopped me from doing anything at all. I had no soul at the time. So I brought her home. She had been in the house with me for a couple of weeks. The goal with my son was reunification, so they were going to try to, you know, get him back with me, and then, you know, hopefully with intent that all the kids would come back with me. And I picked up a drink. Again. That's just what it was. It was just what it was. And I remember that day, again, like it was yesterday. I had half of the city of Marlboro Police Department at my house. I called she's my Big Book Step Study sponsor now, but she hadn't done the process then. I called her and said, come take the baby, because DSS is going to come and take the baby. And by the time she got to the house, you know, everybody was there. The whole, like I said, I had 5 cruisers in front of the house, and they were trying to take her away from me. And they did get her away from me, and then they sectioned me for like the 100th time. I don't even remember where I went. I think they shipped me off to some detox in Boston, where I immediately signed that 3-day waiver to get out. You know, I wanted to sign the 3-day waiver because I wanted to get the hell out of there so that I could drink. That was my only thought. That it really, truthfully, was my only thought. And I got out of there, and I came home, and I can remember sitting in that little beach house. And when you have a baby, you have stuff. I had a swing, I had a bassinet in the living room. I had this little wing chair where I had diapers stacked up and wipes and powder. And I came through the front door, and I sat there, and I was drinking. I drank Captain Morgan. I drank it out of a big 2.75 liter bottle. That's how I drank. I drank that way for years and years. And I was sitting in the living room that day, and with all the recovery that I had, all the tools that I had gained, because I don't think those things are lost to us when we pick up. I think that we still have them. I just think that we don't know how to tap into them. And I remember sitting in the house that day all by myself, and all I could smell was baby powder in the house. That's all I could smell. I could smell the baby powder, and she wasn't there. And all the kids were gone, and their rooms were set up as if they were there. And I had a moment of clarity. It was that simple. It was that fast. It was a moment. And I said to myself, maybe I'll try one more time to go into a halfway house. It was just a thought. So I picked up the telephone and I made some calls, and I got a bed at Faith House. And there wasn't 1 ounce of me that wanted to go into that treatment program. Not 1 ounce. I had done it twice. Who wants to live in a house full of women? New in recovery. It was insanity at its best. The whole 6 months, it was insanity at its best. And that had been proven to me the 2 other times that I had done it, so I definitely didn't want to do it. But I knew that I couldn't continue on doing what I was doing, because I knew in my heart that as good as it was ever going to get for me was being strapped to a gurney in the Marlboro emergency room with Dr. Campano looking at me saying, I think we should try shock treatments with you. And I looked at him and I said, you're freaking crazy. Now, I'm the one strapped to the bed. I'm the one not going anywhere with a guard outside the door. And I'm telling him he's crazy, but he's just trying to save my life. He was trying to save me from myself because of my thinking was gone. I mean, I had nothing. I had no spirituality. I was, soaking wet with so much booze that I couldn't even, I was physically sick. I had all of it. And so I did, though. I entered Faith House begrudgingly. I drank right up until the day that I left. I had to wait 3 days for the bed. And I pretty much just kept myself right up until like the day before I left. And then I started to detox myself. I was never one of these, I'm going to go to detox kind of girls. I'm not that girl. No. I used to detox myself at home. So I entered Faith House almost 12 years ago. And since that time that I entered Faith House, I went through the motions like I always did. But there was something inside of me that was very different this time. There was something very different. After 2 weeks of being at Faith House, the Department of Social Services made a decision that that little boy that was in that foster home in Natick was going to be placed up for adoption. And they told me that they wouldn't place my younger daughter with me unless I signed my rights away to him. So I kind of had put myself in a position where I didn't have a choice, where my attorney told me that if I didn't sign my rights away and I fought in trial, if I lost in trial, that they were going to take them both. So I had to make a deal with the devil that day. And 2 weeks after being at Faith House, I walked into the Framingham Juvenile Courthouse and signed my rights away over to my son. And it was an open adoption, so most painful day of my life still. But through that experience and through that bottom, I've been able to stand and rise again. I am, I am that mother to him that I can be today. And the day before I left Faith House, I remember calling that same sponsor, who's now my Big Book Step Study sponsor, and saying to her, do you think I'm going to be able to do it? And she said, if you keep doing what you're doing, you're going to be able to do it. And at that time, I wasn't even in the Big Book Step Study process. I was just, open AA. I was doing 3 meetings a day. I was doing it. I was definitely doing it. But I hadn't gotten to this awesome work yet. And so I graduated from that house, and I've been sober since. My kids have all come back into my life. I'll tell you a little bit about where they're at. That 2.5-year-old that I brought into that first halfway house is now 23. He just graduated from Westfield State this past spring, and he is a grad student at Salem now, trying to get his master's in psychology. And so that second child that I have, that 16-year-old little girl, she ended up, I made a decision to let, we had joint custody, but she was pretty much raised by her dad in Westboro. Joint custody arrangement back and forth. A couple of years ago, I want to say it's been about 2 years now, she came back to me a full-blown opioid addict. So I've spent the past couple of years trying to save her life in the best way that I know how, which is a lot of tough love. Good news, you have a mother in recovery. Bad news, you have a mother in recovery. She went to the recovery high school in Worcester. I sectioned her to a whole bunch of different places, but she ended up in Grace House in Worcester, which is an adolescent program for young girls, and she graduated from there, and she just celebrated 14 months clean. And then my son Seth, who just turned 14, he's the one that was adopted. He lives in Natick, and he is very much in my life. He comes over and spends time with us. When we can get him, we steal him. He's a great kid. And that youngest, my little one, is going to be 12 in a couple of weeks, and she is the one who's kind of never seen me drunk, which is nice. But we're all together, and you know, life is amazing. But what happened to me in this past 12 years is I was probably about 4 years sober when I got news. I did finally, you know, make a decision to leave that relationship with the father of my 2 youngest kids, and what happened was that I got news that he died from this disease. He was 48. And I was, you know, sober and, like I said, doing Alcoholics Anonymous, and not this process, but when he died, something changed in me, and I started to see myself. He was somebody that I had spent a lot of time being sober with, and had spent some time drinking with, and I think that when we lost him, it was very painful. You know, my kids were 4 and 6, and so it was a difficult thing to have to kind of walk through. But I did walk through it sober, but I started to get that same feeling, that irritable, discontented, restless feeling that I had had, except that I didn't know that I had had it when I picked up a drink after 4 years. Now I had had the experience of progression and started to realize that if I didn't do something different with my program, that I was going to pick up, that I was capable of picking up, that there's a trap door in my bottom. There's still a trap door in my bottom. I'm an alcoholic. I have the mind of an alcoholic, and that doesn't go away. So that sponsor that I keep talking about, she said, why don't you come to a Big Book Step Study meeting with me? And so I did. I went to the Leominster meeting, and I knew right away from that first meeting when I walked in and I heard people talking about God, solution, a book that gives instructions on how to do the steps. I never knew the steps were in the Big Book in that way. I just didn't know. I didn't know what I didn't know. So anyways, I started to go to Big Book Step Study meetings, and I started to listen to people around the room, and I heard a message of recovery, like I said, that I'd never heard before. And I heard people talking about the work and the writing and the this and the that, and I'm like, I got to do this. So I asked her to walk me through the process, and she said yes. And so I started on this journey. I started on this awesome journey of Big Book Step Study. And there were times when, you know, I can remember doing my formal 3rd step with her, and she said, now you'll help other people, right? And I said, oh, absolutely not. And, you know, I just was going through the motions. I just wanted to get to the writing. You know, I needed to be writing so that I could say that I was writing when they went around the room. And so I started to write, and little did I know, you know, that tumultuous bottom that I had brought on quite a few notebooks, let's say. And so I kept going, though, and I kept writing every day. And I was really, by the time I had gotten to this work, I was ready for this work. I wanted this work. I wanted to do it. I wanted to heal my life. I knew I had a God, but I also knew that I didn't have a relationship with him. You know, not the way that other people were talking about having a relationship with God. And I saw something in people in Big Book Step Study that I just didn't see anywhere else. And I wanted what they had. And I was willing to do this. So I started to write, and I loved the resentment part. Loved the left-hand side of the page. That was my favorite. And then I got to the right-hand side of the page where I struggled. I needed guidance, I needed help. I called her all the time. Well, she would come to me with my notebook. She took my notebook. I hated that too. She would take my notebook because I used to write a lot, and she'd be like, I'm gonna bring it back. And she always brought it back, and I know she wasn't showing it to anybody. It's not like, everybody didn't know, that I was all over it, every Marlboro newspaper all the time. It's not like people didn't know what I did. And then she would bring it back to me, and she'd be like, no, you gotta look at this, and you gotta look at that. And she guided me through what the difference between the truth and a lie was. And I started to get this groove on, I started to do those turnarounds, and she started to come to me less and less, and then I got to the fear part, and I was, she's like, start writing your fears, and I asked myself the questions, and she's just go back to the earliest, recollection of what your first fear was, and I can remember it being very young. I can remember it being my father's driving, and he was like really angry behind the wheel of the car, and I used to have this fear of him driving. I used to sit in the back seat. Back then it was station wagons, no seat belts, and oh my God, my father's so angry. And I can remember and it just all flowed. I had well over 100 forms of fear written when I wrote my fears list. And then after the fact, it was funny because my sponsor was sponsoring. There was a few of us, a little pack of women that used to go to the same Big Book Step Study meeting, which was also very empowering. So if you're sitting here and you're writing, get with the people that are writing too. It's nice to have buddies to kind of stepsisters. And so we did that, and it was great. And then later on, I had heard that there was some sort of cheat sheet floating around of a list of fears, and I'm like, how come I never got that? She's like, you didn't need it. So I did make the long list of fears, and it was very enlightening to me, what a fear-based person I was, because I never thought that I was. I kind of always prided myself as being the tough girl, the one who didn't get affected by fear. I kind of, especially the way I lived my life, when I look at the reckless way that I lived my life, and I think now that, wow. And today, by doing the writing on the fears, I feel it now. I feel it in my gut when I start to get afraid. And there's a fear prayer in here that I use all the time. I say this prayer multiple times a day, The funny thing about fear is that it doesn't really go away, it crops up. It crops up like it says, and it crops up for me. I'm not a fearless person. I'm definitely somebody that experiences fear. It depends on what heartstring it pulls on. I have, like I said, I have a 16-year-old who's not been through this process, let's say, and she does go to meetings, but I fear her disease. I fear my own disease. I sponsor women. I fear their diseases. I mean, I have a lot of fear in my life, but today the solution is God for me. It's always God for me. And it depends on how well I'm working step 3 as to how well that works for me. I can stay plugged in with people who are walking on the same path that I'm on, or I can choose to isolate and get in my own head. Because remember, I said that I'm a chronic alcoholic and that I have the mind of an alcoholic. That also doesn't go away. I've kind of learned that through my own bitter experience, that this is a disease. I believe it to be a disease. I believe it manifested itself in me as a young child when I was talking about how I used to be afraid of my father's driving and the 10,000 other things that I was afraid of as a child. I lived my whole life that way, except that I didn't know what it was. And today I do. Today I go to a lot of Big Book Step Study meetings. I've been gifted with a few women who want to do this work, which is the best thing that I do. A couple of years ago, I was running a Big Book Step Study meeting up at the Orchard Street program. It was kind of funny. It was a God moment for sure. It kind of got dropped in my lap. Not really. It got given to me by God. That program that I entered so long ago, the Sigourney Street House, moved to Leominster. And there was an opportunity to bring commitment up there. So I did that for a year and a half. I brought this big book, up there with the women and the babies in the house. The women who didn't have custody of their kids, who were on the verge of losing their kids if they didn't complete that program or get clean and sober. And so I did that for a while, and now I do the same thing at Spectrum every Thursday night on the women's unit. And what we do is just bring the big book up, and it's kind of laid back big book. So we just kind of go through the cycle like we do here in Big Book Step Study. And the gift in that is that nobody's actually doing the writing there, but it's exposing people to what this book is, which is something that I never learned. I went to a lot of big book meetings in Alcoholics Anonymous, and we read it, but I just didn't know. I didn't know about this, the list, how it breaks down the steps. I didn't know there was a fear prayer. They're just things that I could not have gotten anywhere other than Big Book Step Study, and God brought me here to these meetings. It is the biggest gift that I have ever given to myself. And I wouldn't trade this life that I have today for anything. My recovery is first, always. It comes before my children. It comes before my family. It comes before my job. It comes before everything that I do. Because without this, there is no that. And I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, like I said earlier, there is a trapdoor in my bottom. If I do not continue to do this work and continue to stay connected with the women that I have in my life that keep me right-sized and keep me walking close to the ground on a humble path, I too am eligible to pick up a drink. There is no question in my mind. So I have to continue this. I have to continue this work all the time. So that's about all from me today. Thanks.
Wow.